Anyone who's ever worked at an entertainment venue will tell you the same thing. Health and safety comes above all else. After all, people are there to have a good time, not to have their lives put in danger. And if the worst happens, you want to make sure you have every opportunity to get everyone away from harm. That's why most entertainment complexes have strict safety guidelines to ensure their guests don't wind up a statistic. Sometimes, though, the fun comes to a tragic end. Dublin in 1981 was a city in some degree of turmoil, and that's because it was still in the midst of the Troubles, a period of Irish history where the country was effectively in a state of civil war over its inclusion in the UK. And while most of the violence that broke out as a result was located in Northern Ireland, specifically Belfast, that didn't mean the southern capital didn't have its own fair share of issues too. Of course, on account of them being forced to live in such a reality every day, the youth of the country took any opportunity they could to let loose and enjoy their lives. If they didn't find something to take their minds off of what was going on all around them, they might just go collectively crazy. So that's part of the reason why nightclubs became such a popular hotspot of activity at the time, as it gave people the chance to meet up with their friends over a few drinks and dance their troubles away. No pun intended. And of the various nightclubs located all throughout the city, one of the most popular was the Stardust, a former food factory converted into an entertainment venue that consisted of a dance floor, a single stage, 2 bars and 2 seating alcoves, and was located in a northern suburb of Dublin. The club became so popular that on weekends it wasn't uncommon for almost 1,000 patrons to fill its halls at any given time. And on specific holidays, such high numbers were pretty much guaranteed, which was exactly why it was filled to capacity on Saturday, February 14th of that year. Yes, Valentine's Day was always a great day for venues looking to bring in young people, as couples often took it as an opportunity to go out on dates. And for those who were single, well, it was the perfect excuse to get out there and try to find a new partner, at least for the evening if nothing else. That's right, on this International Day of Romance in 80s Dublin, where better to find a potential mate than a nightclub where you could buy a drink, scout the dance floor for a while, then swoop in to make your move on your guy or girl of choice. On this particular evening, though, the last thing on anyone's mind by the time it was all said and done would be finding a hookup, and that's because they'd all instead be trying to stay alive. But before the fire that caused that panic took hold, there were no such worries in the air. No, when the club initially opened at around 10 p.m. on Friday the 13th, everything was about having a good time and letting loose for a few hours. It didn't matter if the day was perceived to be an unlucky one. That was all just superstition. And anyway, it would be the 14th soon enough, and at that point it was all about romance. What patrons of the Stardust nightclub didn't realize at the time, however, was that Friday the 13th was never destined to be their day of bad luck. No, that wouldn't happen until the clock struck midnight and a new day dawned. It was somewhere between 1 a.m. and 1:30 a.m. that a small fire started in the storeroom on the first floor of the building near the roof. What made that all the worse was that the room contained a number of highly flammable materials, such as 45 drums of cooking oil storing 5 gallons apiece, a large quantity of sodium chlorate toilet cleaner, and lots of general paper and plastic. Needless to say then, it didn't take long for that small fire to become a large one and for it to spread to other parts of the building, with staff first becoming aware of it at around 1:30 a.m. when they noticed a blaze breaking out on a PVC-coated polyester fabric seat inside an alcove in the main hall. And while they would attempt to try to hide it and deal with it as quietly as possible by pulling a curtain over it and attempting to extinguish the blaze in private, their attempts proved to be fruitless, and before long the winners of a dance competition who had been gathered together on the stage could clearly see something was amiss. Once they became aware of the situation, the other 841 people in the building soon became aware too. Not that they needed the fire in the alcove pointed out to them by then though, as come 1:45 a.m., the ceiling above was starting to melt. Yes, at that point things were turning into a nightmare scenario as flammable materials dripped down onto clubgoers and caused them to suffer pretty serious burns. Of those who managed to avoid such materials, it wasn't like they were out of danger as the heat and smoke was now also reaching a level that was completely unmanageable. Of course, part of the reason those two elements got so out of control so quickly was because of the lax health and safety measures taken when it came to furnishing the venue. Not only did the PVC coating on the alcove seating cause the fire to gather steam quicker than it might have otherwise, but the polyurethane stuffing stored within the seating led to the room temperature climbing to 815 degrees Celsius or 1,499 degrees Fahrenheit in under 1 minute. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it also created a situation where smaller flashover fires could start breaking out and bellow smoke out into the premises. Smoke that soon swept through every nook it could find. Obviously, that made it difficult for people to see or breathe as the full weight of what was happening finally dawned on them and they attempted to make their escape. As Paul Fitzmaurice, a young man who was there that night with 3 companions, would later tell an inquiry, complete panic broke out at that point. That panic led to all 4 making the decision to get out of the venue as quickly as possible through a passage leading to the main entrance. But when that proved to be impossible due to all of the doors being locked, they instead tried to get out via the roof exit. In Paul's own words, quote, "On the night of the fire we went into the passageway leading to the main exit where there were a lot of people. The panic started when the lights went out and everyone was being crushed because there were so many people in there. My worry was not of the fire, it was of being crushed. There were a lot of people in there screaming. The doors were closed and nobody could move anywhere, and as people were coming into the hallway, we were getting pushed and squeezed further and further. I went up the stairs to the side of the hall to get out of the crush." Unfortunately though, as Paul and his companions were making their way up the stairs leading towards the first floor where they hoped to find a way out, one of several fireballs snapping into existence in the Stardust blocked their path. Again, in Paul's own words, quote, "The flame shot out on top of me. I immediately put my hands to my eyes and it was then I got burnt. As a result of the burning, the skin was burnt on my face and hands and I fell back down the stairs." But while that could have very easily led to the death of the young man in question right there and then, thankfully he would make his escape in the end when, as he got back to his feet, he was swept up in a wave of people pouring out of the building as the roof door was finally opened above them. Sadly, however, the same thing could not be said of the 3 people he was with that night as they all ended up perishing in the fire before they could get out. His friends, David Morton, Mary Keegan, and Martina Keegan, all died inside the nightclub as it burned from the inside out. 19-year-old David was at the club with some colleagues from the supermarket Super Quinn, and he later met up with his girlfriend, 16-year-old Martina. 19-year-old Mary was Martina's older sister, and the two had arrived at the club with a third sister, Antoinette, who managed to escape. That exact same scenario was playing itself out in other parts of the building by now as, back over at the front door, desperate patrons were still trying to burst through the locks holding them inside. Some had even taken to running into the bathrooms and trying to escape through the windows located there, as that felt like their only hopes of survival at that point. As Paula Toner, someone who was only 17 at the time of the incident, later put it when she was questioned in court, quote, "I could see fellas and girls banging at the windows of the toilets. A couple of fellas got up on the windows on the outside and broke the glass of the windows. I could see people's hands sticking out through the window. Somebody tied ropes around the bars of the toilet window and tied the ropes onto a white van, and they tried to pull the bars off with the van, but the bars didn't come off." Clearly, the escape path they were trying to create was not going to work out, and Paula quickly realized that. which was exactly why she made her way back through the crush of people in the dance hall, dodging fireballs and flames as high as 4 feet or 1.2 meters along the way over towards the main doors, where by now someone had managed to break the locks and pry them open. While that would ultimately be both her and other people's pathway towards freedom, it wasn't like there was much cause for celebration once they reached the outside air once again. No, if anything at that point, the situation took on an even more somber tone as they all had a chance to take a breath and finally comprehend what was still going on with the others inside who hadn't been so lucky. Paula would later go on record saying, quote, "There was pandemonium, and then everything just went quiet. The silence just went through everyone that was outside. The whole place just went deadly quiet because the hands disappeared and the shouting stopped and we knew what was basically happening inside." The reality was, of the hundreds who were still trapped in the Stardust nightclub at that point, 48 would die, with all of those people being between the ages of 16 and 27. As if that wasn't bad enough, a further 218 would be injured as a result of either smoke inhalation or severe burns. It didn't matter if the emergency services were already on the scene by then. For many, it was simply too late. Still though, even if that was the case, the first responders did anything they could to help as many as they could, and there were certainly plenty who needed help. It's just as well there was so much of it on hand then, because not only would the Dublin Fire Brigade arrive at around 1:51 a.m., but pretty soon after that, ambulances from Eastern Health Board, the Dublin Civil Defence, the Red Cross, the Order of Malta Ambulance Corps, St. John Ambulance Ireland, and the Airport Fire Rescue Service also showed up. And as if that wasn't enough, drivers in the vicinity also appeared offering their services after local radio stations had reported on the situation and asked for anyone who had the space in their vehicles to take people to the hospital. But for as much as the city rallied together to try and help in any way it could, it wouldn't change the fact that it was one of the biggest disasters Dublin had seen in some time. And because of that, there was an immediate desire for answers in the days and weeks that followed. People wanted to know how such a thing had been allowed to happen. Was it a freak accident? Was it malpractice on the part of the venue? Or was it something more sinister behind the fire that broke out that morning on February 14th? These were the questions the initial inquiry was hoping to get to the bottom of when it held its first public meeting just 12 days later. What they would ultimately find over the course of that meeting and the others that came later was that the fire had indeed started sometime after midnight, and that the initial breakout first became apparent to people when it was spotted in the seating alcove inside the ballroom. As for what had caused it to first break out, that was far more difficult to ascertain. There was even a point early on when, after receiving testimony from a number of survivors of the incident, Judge Roy Keane, the man chairing the tribunal, felt like an answer to that question might never come. But that would change once representatives of the Forensic Science Laboratory took the stand and argued that the probable cause of the blaze was someone setting one of the seats in the west alcove alight with a match. The reason they believed that was because of misinformation given to both them and the British Fire Rescue Station when they visited the site a few days after the disaster and were told the only possible fire risk in the Stardust that night had been the PVC-coated polyurethane stuffed seating. As it turned out, though, that was a lie. In fact, there was an extensive fuel load housed in the storeroom above the main bar. And as if that wasn't enough, the lamp room located next to the storeroom had a history of electrical faults breaking out over the prior months, with that including incidents of smoke, excessive heat, and sparks. Not that the tribunal heard any of that at the time, however, just as they didn't hear that the storeroom and the lamp room weren't separated by a thick block wall as per fire regulations, or that the electrical installation in the building was considered to be substandard by an independent body. As fire consultant Robin Knox would later state, quote, "The expert should and ought have sought knowledge of the nature and volume of the combustibles within the building. They appear to never have been made aware of the roof space and its voluminous combustible contents. There was a substantial volume of fire fuel stored in the storeroom to sustain and develop the outbreak of fire, whatever the cause of ignition. This fundamental fact was not considered by the tribunal or any of the other experts." So, because none of that crucial evidence was given to the tribunal for consideration, it meant Judge Roy Keane would end up coming to the wrong conclusion, with that being that the fire had likely been the result of an arsonist. And because it was deemed to be arson, the owners of the Stardust were found to be not criminally liable. They were actually awarded £700,000 in compensation from the state after the fact. That would be the equivalent of more than £2.5 million today. As for the survivors and the families of the victims, though, they'd have a much harder time getting justice as, aside from them now feeling like the blame for the fire was being shifted to one of their own, the compensation they'd receive would be as little as £5,000. In fact, of the hundreds affected, only 5 people received payouts of £100,000 or more, with that still being only a percentage of what was given to the venue itself. As if that wasn't bad enough, over the years that followed, the trauma of what took place inside the Stardust that night led to 25 of the survivors attempting suicide. So clearly that was an injustice that still had to be resolved. And that was why those affected continued to fight for proper answers, as they all had their doubts about whether or not a lone arsonist really had been the cause of the blaze. In an independent report commissioned by the families of victims in 2003, consultant electrical engineer Patricia O'Carroll concluded that ignition by an electrical fault could not be ruled out as the reason behind the blaze starting. Still, even with the findings of that new report under their belt, it took until 2009 for the families to convince the Irish government to do anything. And the only way they managed to do that at all was by holding a sit-in at a government building as a means of protest. That finally got some gears turning, enough to where an independent examination of the case submitted by the Stardust Victims Committee for a reopened inquiry into the Stardust fire disaster was formally commissioned. Sadly, though, despite Paul Coffey, the man in charge of the examination, coming to the conclusion that the initial arson findings were hypothetical at best, it was still deemed in the best interest of the public that the inquiry not be officially reopened at the time. No, all that would happen would be that a single paragraph in the original inquiry was altered to state, quote, "The cause of fire is not known and may never be known. There is no evidence of an accidental origin and equally no evidence that the fire was started deliberately." It wouldn't be until September 25, 2019, a full 38 years after the Stardust fire, that the Irish Attorney General finally caved to continued public demands and announced that fresh inquiries would be held into what exactly took place on that fateful night. And while those inquiries are still ongoing as of the time of this recording, meaning there isn't a final answer yet about what the end result will be, the fact that they're being carried out at all is already something both the survivors and the families of the victims are deeming to be a major victory. As Professor Phil Scraton, a criminologist who'd previously fought for victims of the Hillsborough disaster and received justice, put it, quote, "This has been a long-running sore. We are talking about over 40 years. We are talking about the number of deaths. 48 people died. So many people damaged for life. The denial of justice for so long has only exacerbated people's suffering." As Antoinette Keegan, the survivor of the fire who lost 2 sisters during it, told media when it was announced that the inquiry would be reopening, quote, "It means an awful lot to me and my family. Both my parents, John and Christine Keegan, put an awful lot of effort into this, and it consumed their lives to get truth and justice put on public record. Hopefully then, this time the inquest will receive all the relevant evidence required to come to a full and educated decision as to how the fire started, including not only the history of electrical faults and the flammable material stored in the roof area of the Stardust, but also the fact that head doorman that night, Tom Keenan, is on record stating that he had been advised by his employers to lock all the doors once everyone was inside, even though it was known that was illegal and highly dangerous. And while those affected are awaiting the results, they can at least continue to pay tribute to the fallen by visiting the Stardust Memorial Park housed in Bonnybrook, a park that was first opened on September 18, 1993. The 48 people who perished in the fire are 17-year-old Michael Barrett, 17-year-old Richard Bennett, 18-year-old Carol Bissett, 23-year-old Jimmy Buckley, 19-year-old Paula Byrne, 17-year-old Carolyn Carey, 21-year-old John Colgan, 18-year-old Jacqueline Croker, 18-year-old Liam Dunn, 26-year-old Michael Farrell, 18-year-old Michael French, 18-year-old David Flood, 20-year-old Thelma Frazier, 16-year-old Josephine Glenn, 18-year-old Michael Griffiths, 20-year-old Robert Hillock, 21-year-old Brian Hobbs, 24-year-old Eugene Hogan, 27-year-old Murtaugh Kavanaugh, 19-year-old Mary Keegan, 16-year-old Martina Keegan, 17-year-old Robert Kelly, 17-year-old Marie Kennedy, 15-year-old Mary Kenny, 18-year-old Margaret Kiernan, 18-year-old Sandra Lawless, 25-year-old Frances Lawler, 26-year-old Maureen Lawler, 19-year-old Paula Lewis, 18-year-old Eamon Lawman, 17-year-old Donna Mahan, 22-year-old Helena Mangan, 18-year-old George McDermott, 16-year-old Marcella McDermott, 22-year-old William McDermott, 20-year-old Julie McDonnell, 16-year-old Teresa McDonnell, 21-year-old Gerard McGrath, 17-year-old Carolyn McHugh, 20-year-old James Miller, 19-year-old Susan Morgan, 19-year-old David Morton, 19-year-old Kathleen Muldoon, 17-year-old George O'Connor, 23-year-old Brendan O'Meara, 18-year-old John Stout, 19-year-old Margaret Thornton, and 17-year-old Paul Wade. One thing the survivors certainly won't be doing now is revisiting the Stardust nightclub as, despite attempts by the leaseholder and manager to reopen in 2006, it remains closed, with the grounds it once sat on now being used as the site of another memorial. And that's probably for the best, because if, as it now increasingly appears, the fire that broke out there was caused by the poor safety practices of the owners and operators of the nightclub, then they should never be allowed to open such a venue again, lest it lead to the deaths of more innocent young people whose only crime was that they were looking to have a good time for a few hours. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.